No, that's what happens, you know, and we agreed to do that, actually. And I would like to welcome to this panel, in Spanish, is Las historias que se resisten a callar. In English, stories that should be told. And I'm very glad to introduce you to Masha Gessen from Russia and from United States. You know, it's a ¿cómo se llama eso en inglés? Ni en español lo puedo decir. How do you do that? Huh? US, Russian citizenship? No, fregues, no. Okay, so just keep on doing my cheese. So Masha Gessen, it's, well, she's a very well-known journalist. Right now, she says that it's only a columnist, but actually she has done lots of works in Russia, especially a book, I think one of the most important, interesting book written on President Putin, Vladimir Putin. And because of that book, she had to fled the country with the family, and right now she's based in Nueva York. In New York, she's a columnist for New Yorker. As well, we have somebody that it's just more near than Russia, no? That being, you know, in Russia. His name is Joseph Poliszuk, Venezolano. It's a Venezolano, no? This is gonna be very tricky, no? It's Venezolano. And I met him once in the newsroom in Semana because I was wondering why on earth there were so many journalists from Venezuela fooling around in the newsroom. And they told me, you know, those guys are from Alfredo Info. Armando Info. You see, that's what happened. Armando Info. And I said, well, Armando Info, it's what? Armando, Juliana, Raquel. I didn't know what was really. Well, this is a story that is going to address, because the name, it's important. They belong to the most, I think that one of the most interesting investigative journalism group in Venezuela. They had to fled the country because of the stories he had done in Venezuela, and right now, 4 of them are based in the newsroom in Semana, see? But 12, at least, they're still in Caracas. They had to leave their country because of what they have been doing, reporting in Venezuela. So I would like to begin this panel asking them, first Masha, first time in Colombia, first time in Latin America, no? Bienvenida, Masha.
Thank you.
But I would like to ask you both, but first Masha, I mean, you wrote this book on Vladimir Putin in a moment in which he was, you know, a very difficult figure to cope with, not only journalistic speaking, but politically speaking. How did you manage to get through the sources? How did you manage to build up the story in order for you to publish this book, which was being, you know, if you read Arcadia, you know, Arcadia has a very interesting article on the book written by Masha. So,
thank you. Well, first of all, thank you so much for putting up with English for my sake. I apologize that I don't speak Spanish. And I should actually, I think I have a small correction. I don't know that the reason I was forced to leave the country had to do with the book, or whether it had to do with my involvement in the protests in 2011, 2012, or just with my being queer, or all of those things together. I don't know, right? But I was, like many people, I was targeted and forced to leave the country. So I was researching my book on Vladimir Putin from about 2008 to 2011. And I'd say the book combines several approaches. I mean, it's an attempt at a biography of someone who has a very small public record and who, of course, didn't speak to me. And it was also a fine sort of dance to try to get other people to speak to me, because I couldn't let anybody know that I was working on a biography of Putin. So I was telling people that I was writing a book about Russian politics, and often I would have much more wide-ranging interviews than what I was actually interested in order to sort of cover my tracks. But my approach to the biographical part of the story was that I thought it was very important to understand how Putin himself wanted to have his story told. And so the paucity of his public record actually became an advantage. Because I thought, okay, here's somebody who nobody knew anything about until Yeltsin plucked him out of obscurity in 1999. And so what did he want the world to know about him? And what does that tell us about him? And that was an amazing exercise, because there was actually so little material that it was possible for me to listen repeatedly to every interview he had ever given, watch every video, read. He had sat down for 6 interviews. I mean, that's all he had done. He had sat down for 6 interviews with journalists, biographical interviews, right? So that was, it was sort of an interesting study in the creation of a public character. The other parts of the book had to do with actually investigating some of his background. So his background in the KGB, especially in Dresden, his background in the St. Petersburg government, and the apartment building explosions in Russia that accompanied his rise to power, right? And since then, since I wrote the book, there have been other people's books that have, and one other thing I forgot to mention, political assassinations. That was another thing that I was trying to investigate. And I tried to push them out of my mind. On most of these things, since my book came out, there have been separate books just on the topic of his work in St. Petersburg by Karen Dawisha, a separate book on the apartment building explosions, and a lot of work on the political assassinations. There's a lot of fodder there. I can talk about those investigations, but I think one thing that I can say sort of about all of them together is that when you work in an environment like this, and I think this is familiar to a lot of people here, your work will never be complete, right? Because if you can't trust public source material, if you can't trust law enforcement at all, if you can't trust the courts at all, then you're your hands are sort of tied behind your back, right? You can't rely on police records, you can't rely on court records. Everything becomes hearsay. And so, I feel uneasy about the results of that work, because it is inconclusive, and it will always be inconclusive. That's the nature of the thing that I'm trying to describe, right? But I think that what I was...
Can I ask you something? You said that the judiciary source was not reliable. I mean, as a source, it was not reliable. Why was not reliable? Why is it that it was really not worthy to rely on that?
Well, it wasn't equally unreliable in all cases, but I'll just give you an example. So that the apartment building explosions in '99 were the subject of court hearings in 2001, 2002, and by that time, the courts were entirely subservient to the executive branch.
Yeah.
So the court said what they were supposed to say.
Yeah.
So you no longer have, if in a country with a fully functional court system, it may not be 100% reliable, but we as journalists treat it as a kind of signpost, right? These are the facts as we know them. And you can't do that in Russia, right? You know that any court case is inherently unreliable. Any case by the prosecution is inherently unreliable, right? Let me just say a couple of words about the St. Petersburg stuff, which was actually in a way more interesting, and then I'll cede the floor. So from 1990 until 1996, Putin was the vice mayor of St. Petersburg, so Russia's largest city. And there I was able to work with actual materials of an investigation conducted by the city council, which found grounds for charging him with embezzlement in connection with the disappearance of about $100,000, which at that time was a huge amount of money in Russia. Now it's pocket change for the corrupt Russian politicians, but in the early 90s it was a vast amount of money. And in fact, this may be interesting because this was money that was tied up in contracts that were supposed to be used to import food because St. Petersburg was on the verge of famine in 1991, and so the federal government released strategic resources that were supposed to be bartered for food imports. And Putin entered into bad contracts so that money could be written off, and the money disappeared. So, it's a familiar story, right? So there was an investigation. The city council asked the mayor to have Putin prosecuted, and in response, the mayor dissolved the city council. And then St. Petersburg had no city council for about a year, but Putin was never charged. So what I needed to do was I needed to get the investigation, which was in the archives, that I was able to get. But I really wanted to talk to the people who had been in charge of the investigation. One was dead and one had disappeared. And so it took me about a year to find her, because everyone told me that she was abroad, and I kept trying to figure out where she was living abroad. And finally it turned out she was living in the woods, I mean literally in the woods, about an 8-hour drive from Moscow. And she called me one morning and said, okay, you can come now. And I think it had to do with a kind of shift in the mood in the country. Like suddenly she wanted to talk. She felt like there was an opening and she wanted to talk. And I knew that like I had to go now. So I called my best friend and asked him if he would drive with me. And we just got in my car and drove. And her directions were drive, she gave me directions, and she said, okay, and then once you're in the woods, drive as far as you can, then park the car and walk the rest of the way. And wow. So I went, and she was living in this house in the woods, in hiding, and she wouldn't she wouldn't tell me what kind of threat had made her go into hiding. But she spent a day with me, giving me documents and talking to me about the investigation. But the biggest lesson of that is like the oldest journalistic lesson in the world, which is that I just had to keep at it for a year to try to first find her and then get her to talk to me.
Yeah, that happens quite often. Well, Joseph, you have, since you are not Russian, you don't have that sort of situation to cope with. But you have done an incredible work as a journalist with your group, researching what happens in Venezuela. Tell me what happened. Why did you decide with your bunch of buddies to find out the way to publish the stories and to build up this investigative team? And why you are here in Colombia and not in Caracas?
Yeah, good afternoon. Thanks to the foundation. It's a pleasure to me to be here. Usually, I have to confess you that I don't talk about me, even less in English. So
that was
sorry if something wrong at all. Anyway, I am going to tell you the story of Armando.info, which is a little bit my story in the last year as well. I founded Armando.info with my colleague Eval Scharfenberg 2 years ago. We two are the editors, and we founded the unique website dedicated exclusively to the investigative journalism in Venezuela. And we found it with two other colleagues, Alfredo Mesa, who is now in CNN, and Emilia Diaz, who is now in Washington in the International Investigative Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And we decided to do it during the riots, the first riots against Maduro's government in 2014. But in that time, the government, the new government, the Maduro's government, decided to buy the most important and traditional media. And it was my case. I used to work for almost 10 years in the investigative unit of El Universal. And can you imagine? Oh, so I forgot to tell you that the government didn't buy the media officially. They used their businessmen who are around them, and they also didn't do officially. They use offshore companies. Even today, we don't know who is the owner of El Universal and many others, newspapers, TV channels, etc. So imagine you were writing about money laundering, drugs, corruption, and you don't know who is paying you the salary. So it happened, and some human rights, and the other one dedicated to follow the corruption. I think that journalists, we really have obsessions, and I think that the corruption is our obsession in the case of Armando.info, because you, I suppose for sure that you know a lot of Venezuelan migrants, but behind them, behind the problems of Venezuela, there is a system, and there is an economical system, an elite that support the corruption. We, for example, published a work that showed the last year, thanks to the data journalism, we showed 800 military who are contractors, who have contracts with the government. I mean, at the same time, they are generals, colonels, they build buildings, official buildings, they import food, and do service to the government. We, thanks to the same methodology, we found that a half of our Joshes, they are not just Joshes, they are part of the official party. I mean, they are not just lawyers who work to the judicial system. They also are militants. So they are not independent. And in the middle of these stories, we found, we follow a story that have changed a little bit our life. And it's story about the club. The club, Comité Local de Abastecimiento y Producción, is the food program of the government that Maduro's government sold as a solution to the hunger of the poorest people. But more than a solution, it's like a business. And what we found? We found that the food is not, that doesn't have quality. We did chemistry test to the milk, and we found that a normal glass of milk is the same than 41 glasses of the milk that the government is giving. Can you imagine a salty milk? This is what we found, milk with sodium, without calcium, without vitamins, and more than this, we identify the group that has an offshore scheme to do that business, so it's not a solution. They use offshore companies, and we found the bills of that groups, and they increase the prices of that milk. So we identified the group, and inside this group is a gentleman, a businessman, by the way, a Colombian businessman whose name is Alex Saab, and he decided to demand us. And you would say, what's the problem? And I say the same. But I told you that we don't have an independent judicial system. And more than this, we had, I had to tell you that the lawyer of that guy was the representant of the party, of the government party. And this guy was denounced by the prosecutor, Luis Ortega Diaz, who is in Colombia, as the proxy of the president, of Maduro's president. Maduro.
But why you decided to leave the country?
Yes, and it's a good opportunity to, we decided to leave
you have been,
because
they're doing is, they have been keeping running stories, investigative stories from outside Venezuela, which I think it's one thing that you can do now through the internet, which is important as well. I mean, stories should be told no matter what. But what happened right now, because I've seen you in the newsroom in Semana.
Yes, and it's a good opportunity to
Caracas.
say thank you to Colombia, and more than Colombia, to the Semana magazine, because they opened their offices in order to continue our work, because the problem was not so much our safety. The problem is that I think that he decided to use that kind of censorship in order to don't talk, to prohibit us to continue with that case. And it's not just one more case of corruption. We are talking about the hunger of the Venezuelan people. And we think that we had to continue, and Semana opened their offices in order to continue. And it has been a challenge because our press room is divided. 4 of us, we are outside, and 12 are still in Caracas. Thanks to the technology, we can do it.
Well, I was just wanting, hearing you, I think that it's becoming very tough to do the stories that should be told, no? When you have so much corruption and so less, I mean, so and the democracy is so weak because of the corruption. How you deal with that? I mean, how as a journalist, I mean, that was something that really stressed you, and this, I mean, that was something that really make you at one certain point decided, you decided, it's time me to go outside my country and I don't know, go outside and see another things and run different way things. I don't know. It's tough. It's very tough to do that. I know. I know. So, what's your case? What's your?
I can no longer talk about myself as a Russian journalist. So I think I'd rather talk about other people who are actually doing this incredible work. And I think that what the advantage that we have now in 2018, as opposed to like the period I was trying to investigate, which was the 90s and the early aughts, is that they can't help leaving traces. And so it's there's a foundation in Moscow, the Alexei Navalny's foundation, which is probably, and it didn't even start out as a journalistic enterprise. It started out as an activist enterprise, but they have become probably the most important media outlet on corruption, because they have become such masters at sort of at tracking these traces that the money leaves, at investigating offshore accounts, at using the mechanisms of transparency that exist in the countries where they park their money. So, they use British records, Spanish records, even some Turkish records to figure out where the money is going and who owns property where. there's also something that wasn't really available to me, but that is being used very widely now, which is crowdsourcing, and it allows your reporting to be transparent. So probably the most interesting case of that was, again, it's an amateur effort. Right? So this investment guy named William Browder, whose financial auditor was tortured to death in a Moscow jail, Sergei Magnitsky, who probably many people have heard of. He wanted to investigate the death of Sergei Magnitsky. And his death was related to corruption. They had the people who killed him had been involved in a scheme of taking over shell companies and creating fraudulent back tax rebates and taking them out of the country. And they were able to show purely through crowdsourcing that scheme went all the way up to the cabinet of ministers, right? So all the way up to cabinet level. But what they basically did was they put out the call for people to tell them anything that they knew and send them any materials that they had on the small group of characters. The group of characters gradually expanded. They fact-checked everything that they got in, and were able to document this incredible corruption scheme based on that. And it also helps that most of the team is in London. So they get the material, they fact-check it from London, and they've been able to publicize it. And then I was able to write about it back in Russia.
Back
So, yeah, when I was still in Russia.
and you go back to Russia quite often? No.
Not anymore.
Not anymore. Well, so your case, I mean, corruption, it's been much more difficult to cope with than other, problems that you have to face as journalists. I mean,
No, I don't think so. I think that all the cases are quite difficult, and I think that the investigative journalists have to find a methodology in order to find something, and this is what we do.
yeah.
Yeah.
Talking about that, I mean, what happens when you have to write a story and you feel that you don't have... Sorry, no se oye? What happens when you have to write a story and you don't find nor the sources, I mean, reliable sources, because the judicial system is not working, and you have to wait so much, I mean, for find the right one. What happened with the stories that should be told? What happened with the stories?
I think we use 3 methodologies in order to find sources in a country with closed sources. One, data journalism. Then we have to take advantage in a transition. We have to identify the sources that can cooperate with us. And also, if something is not inside, can be outside. We could prove a case of the Sinaloa mafia. We could prove that they use flights in the principal airport of Venezuela, looking for sources and using the law in Mexico in order to open the files. And we use as well the networks, the formal and informal networks of journalists. And these events are perfect for that.
To build up networks.
Yes.
I think, one of the problems with a dysfunctional judicial system is that there's the risk that some stories will just be deleted forever. And that's something that Hannah Arendt wrote about when she wrote about Truth in Politics. She wrote that the biggest problem of lies in politics is that once a fact has been eliminated from mutually understood reality, it's very difficult retroactively to establish it. It's like it's very difficult to tell a truth that has been obliterated. And I think that that's, odd as it sounds, that's a philosophical idea that is very important to keep in mind. One way that I found to deal with it, and there's no good way, right? There are like all sorts of bad ways, because a good way would be to actually be able to get access to proper records, to corroborate everything, in all the ways that we have been taught to corroborate everything. But I also think it's very important sometimes to plant the stake of a story so that it can't be obliterated forever. And so what I did for a while was I would record very long and detailed interviews with people who talked about corruption schemes and just publish them as interviews, making it clear that a lot of it couldn't be corroborated, that this was somebody's story, that to the extent that I could find documentation, I would show that I had been able to find documentation. But at least some part of that story begins to be told.
I would like to pass over to another problem that we face as journalists when you do stories that should be told. It's censorship. Censorship it's something that's always there. It's a burden that you have to face with. I mean, how does it work, censorship, Joseph, in your work and in the way you do things outside or inside Venezuela?
Yeah, I am very worried because I think that the censorship is increasing in Venezuela. I can tell you that I started the university when President Chavez started in the power as well. And I remember when I began doing journalism that sometimes some officials used to close the phones, deny the information, but then the supporters of the government used to be aggressive, used to attack to my colleagues in the street. But then they began closing TV channels. Then they bought the most important and traditional media. And now, what is happening now? They are using, and it's now, and I think that you can share your experience in Colombia as well, they are using the justice system in order to censor. And there are other ways to censor. Some journalists, not just journalists, but we are talking about journalism. There are some journalists that don't have passports. I mean, they are going to take a flight, and when they are in migration, the official tell them that they cannot travel because their passports were reported as stolen. And there are other ways. There is a sophisticated ways of censorship. I mean, sometimes in Caracas, there are areas that our webpage, and not just Armando.info, even El Pitazo, even El Nacional, even La Patilla, you are in an area and you cannot access to that website. But maybe in that park, in another corner, you can access for a short time. And it's so informal that you cannot denounce that way. And it's, and I can tell you something that sometimes people ask why Venezuelans permitted that situation. But it is happening not just with the public operators of internet. It is happening also with private operators. And I would like to mention, for example, the case of Movistar, that is a company of the Spanish group Telefónica. And they are doing that in Venezuela at that moment. And there is another kind of censorship. 3 weeks ago, we received an order in our houses. The editors and Roberto Dennis, my colleague and partner who has coordinated the investigation of the club, Conatel, the institution that regulate the telecommunications in Venezuela went to our houses in order to prohibit to continue publishing. And there is a good news. We publish, we continue doing what we are doing, but we didn't do alone. We publish with the support of 17 Venezuelan websites.
Wow, interesting. We almost did the same thing when Pablo Escobar killed Guillermo Cano.
And there is a case about La Gata, do you remember?
Yeah, after that, yeah.
But you can mention your case. I think that is very important. We are in Colombia.
No, I don't know. We don't have time actually, because I would love. I think we share almost the same, problems, and of course in Colombia we're facing as well many ways of censorship. One of them is when you do stories that, in a way, open up the ties that the judicial system has with many interests, private interests. Odebrecht and many other things. So yes, we do have the same. We do have all sorts of, undergoing censorships, but still, this is not the time for talking about that. So I was just going to go back to censorship and rights, which I think it's an equation, very important equation. Censorship and rights. I would say if we're talking about the stories that should be told, that's a very important equation. How is it working for you, that equation?
Well, again, I'm in no position to complain. I can just describe what's happening to people who are still on the ground in Russia working. So at this point, pretty much all the media that exist in Russia are controlled by the state. So there are several outlets that are web-based and that are not registered as media, and that are either edited in abroad. So there's an outlet called Meduza, which is edited in Riga, which is just outside of, it's in Latvia, just outside of Russia. They are in the European Union, but here's what happens to journalists who report for them. The journalists are still in Russia, and when they publish an investigative report, they're hit with either a criminal libel case or a civil suit by somebody that who accuses them of libel. And the thing is that because they're writing for an outlet that's based abroad, they're not actually considered journalists, so they have they're not protected by the media law. So while the media law reads like it offers journalists a lot of protection, it reads better than it works, but it doesn't even apply to these people. They, as far as the law is concerned, they're private individuals who publish something possibly defamatory online. So that's one way that it works. So every journalist ends up being a lone actor, defenseless against criminal libel and civil libel laws.
So your case? No, the equation between rights, the rights of people that are there. I mean, I don't know, the women's rights, the minorities' rights. What happens in your country with all these rights and censorship? And I mean, what's going on in Venezuela?
I think that the problem of the polarized societies is that we don't have spaces and time, and it's not in the news, those rights. And it's not just a problem, a Venezuelan problem, it's even a problem in the United States. And we have to be, it's very dangerous, and I think that journalists, we have to understand that, and we have to defend the rights of the minorities.
Masha, I read a story written by you. You said you talk about the importance of the language, and you say that right now language has become a tool, a very important tool that we should be aware of. Can you approach on that? I mean, what's your
Well,
opinion
I
on
think
that?
that for us as writers, language has always been a very important tool. But I think that one of the struggles of journalists in non-democratic societies is the struggle to use language meaningfully, because autocrats don't want people to have a shared reality that's based on language. And so, the Russian language is so long suffering because of that. After 70 years of totalitarianism, we had to recover from a time when so many important words were used to mean their opposite. So they would say, democracy or elections or freedom, and they meant their opposite, right? I mean, like an election was when you were forced to go to a place and put a check mark next to the one name on the ballot. That's not an election. So in the 90s, there was actually a lot of very intentional conversation among journalists about how we're going to use language. And it was clear that there were a lot of words that just weren't available to us, right? We couldn't use words that were associated with ideology or with very strong feelings. You basically just had to use nouns and verbs and be very clear and very sort of grounded in order to sound credible. And then Putin came along, and he has a way of using language to obscure facts that does damage to even that, even the sort of the very business-like nouns and verbs of reporting. And I don't know how the Russian language can recover.
Sounds familiar.
I bet it does.
No, sorry, go on. So what happened?
So I think we have to be incredibly aware and incredibly intentional about using language. And what's interesting to me is that some of the what I think are the most meaningful journalistic projects in Russia now, actually they have their roots in underground publishing from the 1970s. And there's one of my favorite projects is OVD-Info, which is a project, an online project that documents law enforcement interaction with the opposition, right? So courts, police, arrests, detentions, threats, all of that. And that's all they do. So they have a bunch of volunteers, they have some lawyers, and some journalists on staff. And all they do is document. And the roots of that go back directly to 1970s underground publications that documented political prisoners in the Soviet Union. And sometimes it would take them a year to put together this much text on a political prisoner. And they had this incredible belief that as long as every word was true, it was so important that it was transcendent, that somehow the world needed that very accurate paragraph about that one political prisoner. And I think that sort of belief in facts is what is ultimately going to save language, if anything is.
Very interesting. Do you have any word on that?
I agree. My world is in Spanish, but I really agree. But more than the language, to me now, outside Venezuela, it's very important the technology in order to contact the sources, because as you know, as we have so much people outside, we have to understand, we are very fragmented and we have to contact, and the technology is very important in that moment to me.
But don't you think, I mean, following what Masha is saying, I think it's very important for us as well to work on the language, because we do have as well problems in terms of the meaning of the words. You know, one word can mean, you know, quite different, you know,
For sure.
especially in very polarized societies.
Yes, I remember about that a saying of Neruda, talking about the words, selecting each one, but it's a poem in Spanish.
Well, but you can, you know the poem? Just do it in Spanish, por favor.
Sí, más que un poema, era un ensayo en el que decía que pela las palabras, se las come, las traga, y sí, hay que seleccionar cada una de las palabras muy bien para poder llegar a nuestras audiencias, naturalmente.
Well, we have to translate that to Masha. We have to grab the words, we have to use it, we have to, you know, taste the words, and we have to use the words in order to find the real meaning of the words. Pablo Neruda, in English. Anyhow, I was just wanting to know if we have finished right now. ¿Quién me dice cuánto estamos, por favor? ¿En español o en inglés? Nadie me dice nada, podemos seguir. Bueno, perfecto. Entonces, 5 minutos. Okay. So, we can open up some questions. I don't know. Okay, Silvia. Okay, Silvia aquí está. That's a good friend from Brazil. Silvia and the lady over there, the young man with a mochila, carrying a mochila.
Hello.
And that's it.
Hi.
And the old man over there. Sorry about the
introduction. Okay.
A ver, Silvia.
Hi, my name is Silvia. I'm from Folha de São Paulo, from Brazil. And I'd like to ask you, I know each country is very different from one another, but you saw the rise of totalitarianism during Putin years. And now it's in Latin America, we have some cases, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and in Brazil right now, in next Sunday, we're gonna have a very serious elections, and it's very likely that a extreme right-wing candidate will win, and he's against laws for the woman, for the gay society, and he's okay. Well, he's an apologist of the military intervention. So I'd like to ask you if you have a thought about this, and if it has something to do with what you saw in Russia.
I'm sorry, I'm in no position to comment on Brazil. So, sorry.
Latin
No.
America in general. Okay.
But we can approach the question in terms of the rising of the populism. Is it something that it's rising, it's been really, you know, increasing or not?
I really would like to stick to things I know something about.
Okay, okay. This is a very good journalist, very good journalist. Would you like to address something? No. Okay, so the lady over there.
Hi, thanks for the opportunity. I'm María Auxiliadora Rodríguez. I'm from Caracas, Venezuela, but now I'm studying at La Pontificia Universidad Javeriana de Bogotá. And my question is, leaving behind the internet and all the tools and opportunities that came with it in terms of connection, what are your projections, I mean, for both of you, for us, the new generations of journalists in our fight against censorship?
I think that the technology is a weapon, a tool, but we always have to fight with all of the tools against the censorship. So if the technology works, let's use.
Young man over there. And then,
But of course that we have taken advantage of the technology in order to avoid the Venezuelan censorship.
a ver, un micrófono para aquí.
Hi, good afternoon. This question is for Masha. You know, several times you said that you don't consider yourself a Russian journalist right now, but I have to ask that since you are queer and Russia is a country where being queer is essentially criminalized, how has being queer impacted the human part of your work? I'm referring to building connections and trust with your sources when you're perceived as another or as a potential threat to the national order or to the morality. And how did you manage to lower the barriers of prejudice with your sources in order to do your work?
No, that's a great question. The reason I actually had to leave Russia was because of the anti-gay campaign. And so for me, it coincided. But you're absolutely right. It's very difficult for somebody at this point in Russia who's perceived as queer to work as a journalist on the ground. I didn't actually really face that problem because, you know, because the anti-gay campaign was manufactured by the Kremlin. It's not like it bubbled up from the ground. It's not like the Russian people were demanding, you know, that the queers be punished. The Russian people weren't thinking about queer people until the Kremlin started talking about them. So I personally didn't really have to deal with it because I just had to leave. But if I hadn't, I think that you're right, sort of for basic kind of reporting, not for, you know, interviewing academics and other people that I would know socially, it would have posed a real problem.
Why do you decided not to go back to Russia?
I'm sorry, why did I decide not to go back to Russia?
Yeah, because you just told me that you never, I mean, you haven't go back.
I'd rather not talk about that.
No? Okay. Sorry. Okay. A ver. Micrófono para...
Hola. Hi. Good.
Aquí primero acá. Espérate que primero va él y después vas tú. Y después vas tú.
Los Estados Unidos embargaron los fondos petroleros venezolanos y tuvieron que recurrir a utilizar sus propias reservas para reducir el precio del petróleo y afectar a Venezuela. Venezuela acaba de renegociar la deuda con Rusia y con China y el petróleo está a $85 el barril. Si Venezuela pasara de producir 1.500.000 a 4.500.000 barriles, tendría una bonanza económica grande. ¿Qué candidato de la oposición y con qué ideología reemplazarían a Maduro?
Bueno, como me hizo la pregunta en español,
Sí.
le voy a responder en español que no soy un analista político. Nosotros hacemos más periodismo de investigación y tratamos de llegar hasta el final.
Bien.
Good afternoon. My name is Andres.
¿Poco más duro? ¿Poco más duro?
My name is Andres. And my question is, I think the people who have to go from their own country.
Can you speak a little bit louder?
Okay.
We don't hear you.
I think the people who have to go from their own country because their work is amazing, like both of them, but they have to go. And my question is, where you and the journalists in general can find motivation to continue working on that way?
I don't know. I think that it's a kind of, it's a way to live the life, and everybody have a spirit of journalist, and it's quite difficult to explain. But I really like I remember that I began covering the local news of Caracas, and I really liked one day covering in the poorest area of Caracas, and the next day in a penthouse, very luxury. I don't know, but I really like what I do, and I really think that it is important to my audience.
Masha.
I agree. It's, you know, I've been incredibly lucky because I had lived in the United States before having to leave Russia for the second time, so I could work in English. Some of my former colleagues have left the country and been able to work in Russian, and some have stayed in the country and have had to give up the work. And I think that, you know, that choice, the choice between giving up your home or giving up your profession, is almost intolerable. So it's not a question of finding motivation to work. It's like the work is its own motivation.
Well, yes, I think we finished. Sorry, tenemos más tiempo para una pregunta, okay? Because can somebody tell me if I have more minutes or no? Sorry, we finished this panel. Thanks very much.
Thank you for
todos
putting up with the
ustedes.
English.
No, and we should say, Masha, we should tell Masha that next time, you know, you can learn 2 or 3 words. Corrupción? No, no.
I think I know that.
Good, no, you know that, no. And a good word is hasta pronto y que vuelvas. Masha. Oíste? And you, I mean, please, welcome. Welcome to Colombia. Okay, thanks very much, and stick there. You know that, no. And a good word is hasta pronto y que vuelvas. Masha. Oíste? And you, I mean, please, welcome. Welcome to Colombia. Okay, thanks very much, and stick there.